All right, yes. Well, today welcome back. We are starting a new book today, the book of Ecclesiastes. I'm just curious because I never have. Has anybody been in a Sunday school type class where they go through the book of Ecclesiastes? Anyone? It's interesting. Well, there you go.
This is the first time.
Yeah.
Boy, this is exciting.
Yeah. I never have either. I mean, and one day I may do it again here, but I did at one church. I did what I called at the time a book a day Bible study, and it basically what I did over the course of like 45 weeks, or 40 weeks, or however long it took, was each day I did a 1 day presentation on this book of the Bible. This is what Ecclesiastes is about. And sometimes it was really good. Sometimes, like Psalms is hard to cover and to kind of get all of the different nuances of it. But at least it was interesting. So that's the closest I came to it. But before we get there, today is in fact March 5th, for those of you keeping track of the calendar. And it was on this date in 1526 in Zurich, Switzerland, that the trial of Conrad Grebel, Felix Mons, and George Blaurock began. The trial took about a week. They were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Okay, does anybody know what their crime was? Does anybody remember what their crime was? This is actually going to come back into the lesson today. 1526 in Zurich, Switzerland.
Was it getting baptized?
Anabaptism, getting baptized again.
Again.
Yes, adult baptism or refusing to baptize their children. So these three guys, these are the three guys who started Anabaptism, Grebel, Mons, and Blaurock. But they all managed to escape from prison, and they took off for other places. So this kind of ties into something I said last week about church history. Okay, they were tried by other Protestants. Okay, so this was not the Catholic Church being the big bad evil Catholic Church. This was the big bad evil Protestant Church. Okay, the Zwingli version, the Ulrich Zwingli version, which would morph into the John Calvin version, but not at this point. Calvin is actually a second generation reformer. He's not a first generation Zwingli, and so they would have these fights with Zwingli. But yeah, so they all got in, and they were all able to escape, which suggests, some have suggested, that people in the know knew that this wasn't a great hill to die on, that they didn't want to make these guys martyrs, although eventually they did. They were all eventually martyred, caught later, some later than others. But be that as it may, so that was the start of their particular trial. It was on this date in 1700 in Boston, Massachusetts, that the incident on King Street occurred. The incident on King Street. This is that moment in time where 9 British soldiers were backed into a corner and fired into the crowd and killed 5 British North American colonists. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, it's because in America we don't call it the incident on King Street, we call it the Boston Massacre. So that's the British version when you talk about the incident on King Street. One of these days I want to find, I've never quite found one, but I want to find a, like history of England written by an Englishman for English people of the late 18th century to kind of see how they describe the American Revolution, because we describe it in certain ways, and again it's just sort of an interesting perspective, again, this kind of will apply to what we're talking about a little bit today. Like, for example, with the War of 1812. Okay, the War of 1812, okay, that's the one that came after. That's the one that was sort of ended by the Battle of New Orleans, even though it was done afterwards. So if you go to Canada, Canada believes they won the people in Canada believe they won the War of 1812. And those of us in America know that can't be right because we won the War of 1812. It's like, well, wait a minute, how can both of us win the War of 1812? It's like, actually, the truth is we didn't really win the War of 1812. It just sort of ended. But again, it's just a difference in perspective kind of thing. I'm sorry, were you going to?
I think I misheard the year of the Boston Massacre.
1700.
1700. What happened in 1775?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. 1770. 1770.
1770. Okay,
1770. I'm sorry.
okay. All right.
1770. Because then they had Boston,
Okay.
commemorations later on. On this date in 1858, Crispus Attucks Day was proclaimed in Boston. And that's significant because Crispus Attucks was one of the 5 individuals who died. He was an African-American seaman, free African-American seaman that just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and was shot and killed. And so they had Crispus Attucks Day in Boston, and they still do to this day. I'm surprised that we don't have Crispus Attucks Day in Illinois. I'm not trying to be funny. Just seems as good a day as any. But again, they'd have to take out I forgot the Pulaski Day. They'd have to eliminate Casimir Pulaski Day, which right now I'm very much against because tomorrow is Pulaski Day, Casimir Pulaski Day. So I would have to go in tomorrow if I didn't. So let's not go there until maybe Tuesday. Let's revisit this on Tuesday.
Are you
Okay.
going to wear a sweater in his honor tomorrow?
I could do that. It was on this date in 1868 that the stapler was invented. On this date in 1953, Stalin died. Joseph Stalin died. There was a kind of a funny movie that came out a couple of years ago. I can't remember the name of it now, but it had Michael Palin in it, and several others talking about the day that Stalin died, it was interesting that they were able to make a funny movie. A movie that had some funny elements in it. I guess it wasn't really, but for the country music fans in the world, it was on this date 10 years later that Patsy Cline died. Patsy Cline, Crazy, which was a song written by Willie Nelson, who is still around with us. But she died in a plane crash. She was 30 years old, died on this date. And this one I'm dedicating to Larry Morgan, who is not with us anymore, but it was on this date in 1965 that Pepper Martin died. Pepper Martin was the third baseman for the 1930 St. Louis Cardinals. Any of you guys who remember Larry Morgan, remember that for some odd reason, he was a huge St. Louis Cardinals fan. It was one of his sins that he never left at the cross. I don't know why, but he was the third baseman for the Gas House Gang back in the 1930s. That was the team that had Dizzy Dean on it. Dizzy and his brother Daffy. I'm not making these names up. Well, that's not their actual name, but their nicknames were Dizzy and Daffy. And Leo DeRocher was on that team too, which means something to those of us who are Cubs fans from the back in the day. But be that as it may. All right, so that's it for March 5th. Now, let's get into Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a really interesting book, and I'm going to start off here with one of the concepts. Well, I'll find out. I'll start out with one of the points that became clearer the more I read about Ecclesiastes. Okay? The more I read about Ecclesiastes, the more I realized that nobody agrees on Ecclesiastes. That there's, I was looking at, so I have several. I mean, the way I approach these, of course, is I've read the books through dozens of times, but I have several like survey sort of books and Bible study guide books, and then I usually I'll when I start a book, I'll go to those, right? Look at the survey book and like Old Testament survey and see, okay, what does it say about Ecclesiastes, and what does this book say about Ecclesiastes, and then once I go through all of those, then I'll go through, like, I've got the NIV Study Bible, and I'll kind of look at the introduction and the stuff about that. But even in one of the study books, they were talking about one aspect of it, and it was the one by I forget who the two authors were, but there were two authors, and in the discussion of Ecclesiastes, they made it clear that one of us believes this, the other one believes that. So even two authors writing a book about Ecclesiastes don't agree about Ecclesiastes.
Was that a married couple writing the book?
Yeah. It's interesting, and so I say that to say, as always, feel free to disagree with me. I'll say, okay, this is one way to look at it, one approach to the book of Ecclesiastes. It may be the correct one. You may have a better one. That's fine. But let's, talk about it and see, and again, what I'm trying to do, you may not realize this, but I'll give away my secret here. What I try to do is not so much say, okay, here's what the Bible says. Okay, I'm not really trying to do that. What I'm trying to do in this particular class is model a way to look at the Scripture, to say that if I can look at a text and ask a bunch of weird questions, you can too. Okay, so it's not, you don't have to wait for me to look at it and go, who's he talking to? What's he talking about? Who's listening? You can do that too. Okay, to kind of give an explanation for that. And if you do that and you go home and you look at a passage and you come back and you say, Stan, I looked at that passage that you talked about last week and I think you're incorrect, then my work is done. Okay, so I'm not saying that I'm going to tell you something that I think is wrong in the hopes that you go home and prove me right or wrong. So if I say it wrong, you're going to come back and prove me wrong, and then we'll make it right. Something like that. I know in the Jewish tradition, one of the things about truth is derived out of the back and forth between one aspect, not always, but I mean one of the things about the conversations and the talking between the rabbis, that truth derives out of that. That you need the conversation, you need the dialogue to come up, that it isn't necessarily something where, okay, I'm going to read this and, get my one, oh, that's what the Bible says, we'll move on to the next verse. I'm sorry.
But you ever read The Chosen by Khan Potak?
No.
Okay. The rabbi in there in his homilies would deliberately introduce a mistake. Every homily had a mistake just to make sure that people are awake, and he would hope that his son would catch the mistake.
Oh.
Just to keep you on your toes.
Okay. So
there we go.
Next time Paul preaches, just word to the wise. I'm just saying here. So all right. So Ecclesiastes. Okay. First of all, I'm trying to, how do you start this? How do you start Ecclesiastes? Okay. Basically everybody knows Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows, to everything, turn, the Pete Seeger song, which was made popular by the Byrds in the 60s. And we'll talk about that when we get to Acts, when we get to Ecclesiastes 3. Okay, everybody knows that. And we all have a favorite passage, a living dog is better than a dead lion, or two are together. I remember when I was at school, it was always fun to point out, when you were talking about girlfriends and, the Bible says if two are together, they can become warm, kind of thing. Because, where I went to school, you were supposed to stay apart. It was really funny at the time. I'm just kidding. So we all kind of have this favorite passage, or we've heard them and we think about them. But it's like, what is the whole book about? Okay. So I'm going to start, and again, this is just my way of doing it. So I'm going to start with what I think is the argument of the book. I'm going to tell you, this is what the book is. This is what the book is about to me. Okay? The book of Ecclesiastes is about the reality of life on earth after the fall. Okay? The reality of life on earth after the fall. Okay? Now, hold that thought. Now, again, not everybody agrees with that. Okay? There are some people that look at Ecclesiastes and say, oh, this is a really encouraging book. It's okay. Good luck with that. I don't know how you get that, but they do. There are some that look at Ecclesiastes as justification for all kinds of weirdness. I know that if you're a diehard existentialist, you can look at this and say, well, that's meaningless. That's just what existentialism is, which isn't exactly a fair description of existentialism, but there is that element. We'll get to that a little bit later, I think. But then it's like when we get to the end of the book, then we'll ask ourselves, okay, what do we do with this? Okay, what do we do with this particular idea? If this is true and we go through this, we say, then what do we do? What do we do with this book? How do we apply this book? Okay, or what do we do with this particular book? I will tell you one thing. This is not a great book for getting life verses out of. Okay, and this, if there's any book in the Bible that I'm familiar with that needs to be taken as largely as possible, it's Ecclesiastes. Okay, do you understand what I mean by that? I mean, some people like to, and this is to me a huge flaw in how evangelicals look at Bible reading. That they like, okay, they get their Bible and they say, okay, God, give me something from the Word today. And you read a verse and you think, okay, all right, that's it. I'm done. I got my verse, got my challenge. I'm powered up. I can go through the day. And you get this atomization, where this breaking down of the text, so that all of these little teeny tiny verses, but you have no idea what the book is about. You have no idea whether the question of what the text is trying to tell you is irrelevant, because we've made the Bible about us. And when you make the Bible about you, then that's what happens. You look at it and go, what does this say to me? Because the Bible is about me. The Bible is a message to me. Well, it's not. The Bible is a book about God. And it tells something about God, even Ecclesiastes, even when we're talking about living dogs and dead lions and all that kind of stuff. So, well, first of all, let's talk about what kind of a book Ecclesiastes is. Okay, Ecclesiastes is generally referred to as wisdom literature. Wisdom literature. And again, we're getting into the question of genres or types of literature, and this is critical anytime you're looking at a text, to understand what kind of text it is, okay? So that you know what to do with it. When you say, what does this mean, or how important should I take this, okay? How seriously should I take this, or how broad should I apply this? You have to understand the kind of text. And so you have, when Moses is telling the children of Israel, you need to do this to get out of Israel or something like that, you have to understand, okay, that's Moses talking to, who's he talking to? Okay, or actually, let's just talk like history books, okay, like Samuel. Okay, we look at Samuel and we say, well, David is a great king, so let's do what David did because it worked for David. It's like, well, yeah, that's not a good idea. Okay, we don't pick and choose. We say because David did this and it worked out well, if we do that, it's going to work out well for us. Okay, I heard a sermon once about, it was on Moody. Somebody was looking at Genesis, I don't know, it's the passage where Abraham's servant goes to find a wife for Isaiah. And he goes through and he shows what the servant does, and he says, he says, well, he looks at he breaks it down into, and you've heard these type of sermons, he breaks it down into several steps, and in these steps he says, well, this is just how you discover the will of God. Just like this guy did, do this, and it worked out for him, it'll work out for you, kind of thing. And that afternoon, in fact, I was literally reading or listening to this as I was on my way to Wheaton College to have lunch with John Walton. John Walton is an Old Testament Bible scholar. I think he's still at Wheaton. He's written several books, and I emailed him once and I said, hey, I'm in Chicago and I really like your book. He goes, really? Come to Wheaton, let's have lunch. So I did. And I went and I told him about this. I said, because, it was a question of Old Testament interpretation at the time. And I said, yeah, what about this? And he said, now this is a guy who knows Hebrew back and forth, Hebrew, Akkadian, Sumerian, all of these ancient languages and stuff like that. But he's like, yeah, usually when you hear a passage like this and you walk away from a story like that and you think, wow, I've never really seen that before, chances are because it's not there. And so that's. So yeah, so I was just proud of myself that I had nailed that one. That I'm like, okay, I'm going to go run. I think this is what I think this is, and he agreed with me. You know how that, sometimes you have somebody who's like an authority figure, and you say, is this right? And they go, yeah, that's absolutely right. And you're like, whoa, I have achieved it. I have succeeded. I'm done. That's it. No, just kidding. So Ecclesiastes is normally considered to be wisdom literature. So wisdom literature, as opposed to historical literature, narratives. We talked about narratives a lot when we talked about Acts. or even when we talked about Luke as well, although Luke's a little different. Okay, so Acts is narrative. It's a historical book. You know, again, it's just telling a story. All right, and so you look at this to see how God moved, how God brought the gospel to Rome, but it's not like you don't look at Acts and say, okay, well, I'm going to pattern my life after the Apostle Paul, and I'm going to do everything Paul said. Okay, which, again, this is the same guy who stands up in the middle of a shipwreck and goes, you know, you all should have listened to me. So that's the kind of guy you're going to be if you pattern your life after Paul. But regardless, wisdom literature usually is limited to 5 books of the Bible. Okay, actually, specifically 3. Okay, Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Okay, there are several Psalms that are considered to be wisdom literature, and sometimes, depending on who you ask, Song of Solomon or Song of Songs or Canticles is considered to be wisdom literature. So most of the time, like if you look at your Bible or your basic Bible study guides, when they talk about wisdom literature, they'll talk about Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Okay, but wisdom literature, again, Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes are the 3 most completely wisdom literature. Does that make sense? There's a lot more than wisdom literature in Psalms, and Song of Solomon is its own thing. Okay, but so wisdom literature is interesting because I've got a kind of a definition here. Wisdom literature is usually a reflection on life as it is actually lived. Okay, it's a reflection on life as it is actually lived. Okay, so wisdom literature writers, that's what WL stands for. WL writers, unlike prophets, okay, and this is kind of a critical point. Unlike prophets, wisdom literature writers do not claim to speak for God. Okay, so the writer of Ecclesiastes is going to say over and over, this is what I observed, this is what happens, this doesn't make sense to me, or this is what, and whereas in Isaiah and Jeremiah and those guys, you've got thus saith the Lord, do this. Okay, so wisdom literature does not claim to speak for God. Okay, so what that means is that matters in terms of how you interpret it or what you do with it. Okay, and we'll touch on that a little bit. Okay, no, we'll touch on it right now. How should we then apply wisdom literature? Okay, now what we do, I think in most of us tend to just ignore wisdom literature. Okay, because again, it's we like Proverbs. Proverbs are great. But I think what we do is we kind of look at Proverbs and put Proverbs up here and like Job and Ecclesiastes down here. When really, they're just as true. Each of them are just as true. Job is another one of those books that we all know the basic story. Well, we know the very short version of the story. Job's a good guy. He loses it all. He gains it back. Right? So then the question is, how many friends come and speak to Job? And there's a lot of people who go, are there friends in Job? Yeah. He's got how many friends? Pardon me? 4. He has 4 friends. First there's 3, then Elihu comes in at the end, the younger one. Okay? And if you read what these 4 friends say, these 4 friends are giving the conventional wisdom of the day. There's no question about it. This is what the truth is today. But we would never... So again, like whenever somebody is using a passage from Job, you got to go, why are you doing that? Well, the Bible says in Job this. Like, whoa, 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 back the truck up. You might want to... Because, if that's a guy... I mean... Would we, Satan tells Jesus in Luke that, if you worship me, I'll give you the kingdoms of the world. Something like that. Okay? So would we say, how would we feel if we went up to somebody who said, I'm worshiping Satan because the Bible tells me to? because I want to have the kingdom of the world. Because the Bible says, if I worship Satan, we would go, wait, there's something wrong with that. So that's kind of understanding the importance of genre, because that's Satan talking to Jesus. It's an offer he's made to Jesus. Yes?
I was reading the Temptation narrative this week, and just again amazed at how Satan used Scripture to try and deceive Christ. But he took it out of context.
Yes. Yeah. So basically, as far as applying wisdom literature, the bottom line is like Proverbs, and we'll talk a little bit more about Proverbs. But Proverbs are principles; they're not promises. Okay. So again, if you base your theology or your actions based on a proverb and assume that that's going to come true because the proverbs support you, you may be right, and most of the time you will be. But not always. For example, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Right? So there you go. If I train up a child in the way he should go, everything's cool. Right? Now, has that worked for every family under the sun? I think we all either have a child or know somebody with a child that you're like, well, wait a minute. As far as I know, that was a really solid family. And yet this child... we know a couple where one child went to the Moody Bible Institute and became a youth pastor and went into ministry, and the other child basically went to prison. Two kids, same parents, same home, one kid. Okay, so you would look at the kid that went to Moody, and you would say, well, they clearly trained up the child in the way he should go. Again, I'm not saying it's not, you want to train your children up right. Okay, and since I no longer have children in my house, I'm more than happy to tell you what you need to do with yours. Just saying, that's just how it is. I'm almost as eager to tell you what to do with your children as somebody without children is willing to tell you what to do with your children. That's my favorite kind of thing. So, and so with Ecclesiastes, I think when we get to Ecclesiastes and we kind of see it, when we get to the end of the book, and again, I always say this, I don't want to spend a lot of time in these books, and then I get to yakking, and next thing you know, we're 6 weeks in. But because again, the more time you take on a particular passage, the more, to me, this is my opinion, the more you miss out on the bigger picture of what the book is about. Okay? And I think when we get to the end of Ecclesiastes, and when we have an idea of what Ecclesiastes is about, then we can look back and go, okay, yeah, I see why that's there. I see how that fits. Because again, Ecclesiastes is one of those books that every once in a while, and we don't really have this conversation much anymore. I mean, I think Martin Luther was the last serious evangelical to ever sit down and have this conversation about any book, where we ask ourselves, why is that in the Bible? I mean, have you ever read a book of the Bible and thought, why is that in there? Why? How does that fit into the picture? I mean, I think Luther was against Ecclesiastes. I know he didn't like James and he didn't like Revelation. Okay, but he was. We'll look back, and so you can look at this and go, wow, because there's some passages in there that really just don't really jibe with a lot of what we think is true about how Christianity should work or how life under the sun should work. Okay, so we'll get that later on. We'll see that later on because, again, as we get to the end and we understand the structure, we'll see sort of like the point that the author is trying to make. What I think the point the author is trying to make, keeping in mind, of course, nobody agrees. It's like everybody kind of has, although I think I like mine, so I'm going to go with it, kind of thing. So, wisdom literature writers utilize multiple tools. Okay, so again, just kind of a general idea of wisdom literature. How do they get their point across? Several tools they use. There's actually more than this. But I guess, so Proverbs, they use Proverbs. The most obvious one to us would be the book of Proverbs. Proverbs, okay? Better it is to live in the corner of a housetop than with a brawling woman in a White House. Okay, right? One of my favorite verses. No, I'm just kidding, dear. I'm just kidding. Kind of kind of thing. When I was a kid, somebody made the suggestion to my dad that you can, there's 31 Proverbs, 31 chapters in Proverbs, and there's 31 days in most months. And so what he would do is before we ate, he would read whatever that day's chapter of Proverbs was. Okay, so for many, 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 many Proverbs, over this went on for quite a few years. Up until the day he died, he was doing this. And so if you look at my dad's Bible, you can see how, like with this particular Bible, this is one, you can see the lines, how certain books are worn and others are not. So like the pages in Proverbs are like falling out, because every day we would go into Proverbs. So for many, 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 many Proverbs, if you start it in the King James Version, I can finish it for you. But the other thing is, and this is kind of, I don't know, this is just the sentimental side of it. If I ever want to hear my dad's voice in my head, all I need to do is get out the King James Version and start reading Proverbs. And then, because again, over and over. You also learn things like Proverbs 18 is the shortest, and Proverbs 24 is the second shortest. I'm just saying. Yeah, shortest verse, I'm like, oh, what day is it? Proverbs 18? Okay, great. Short time, And Proverbs 31 is a long one kind of thing. But be that as it may. So these Proverbs, okay? And they're general statements, usually true, usually accurate, but they're not promises. Okay? They're not promises. I'm not saying ignore them. I'm just saying don't build your house on them. Okay? Does everybody understand what same thing. Proverbs. Sayings, okay? Things that are generally true. So Proverbs, I gave a couple of examples here. Proverbs 17:28. Let's see, what did I... So, even fools are thought wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues. Okay, for a while I wanted this to be my life verse. Operative word there being wanted. Even fools are thought wise. That's kind of a saying, right? Is it always true? If somebody says, if you see somebody and there's an issue and somebody's being quiet, are you going to think, wow, there's an issue here and that person over there is being quiet. He must be really wise. Well, no, not necessarily. That's not necessarily the first thing. But it's, it makes sense, right? It's a saying, okay? Riddles. Sometimes they use riddles. And I gave a couple of examples there. Judges 14. Again, there's wisdom literature throughout the Bible. I guess I should have made that point. There's that fall into these things. Sometimes somebody in the wisdom literature tradition would use a riddle. The best known in the Bible, in the Old Testament at least, is Judges 14. That's Samson's riddle about the jawbone, or what out of death comes life, or something like that. Sweet. That's kind of the best example. And then in 1 Kings 10 is just the statement that the Queen of Sheba comes to visit Solomon and tried him with many riddles, kind of thing. But these are just ways that wisdom leaders would use, tools that wisdom leaders would use. Allegories. Okay, allegories are extended metaphors, and there's an example of one in Ecclesiastes 12 when we get to the end. Okay, when we're talking about, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, kind of thing. I've listened through this thing a dozen times and read through it several times in the NIV, but my brain still resorts to the popular, King James translations. But that's where it's talking about old age, and there's kind of this ongoing discussion of things. When the grinders cease using, or something like that. When he's talking about somebody's teeth kind of falling out as you get older. All right, and then finally they use admonitions. And that's just a command. Like Proverbs 23 is a command. 23:30. No, that's not right. 23:3. 23:3. Well, that's not right. Well, when you sit to dine with a ruler, note well what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are given to gluttony. Do not crave his delicacies, for that food is deceptive. Okay, so again, this is, it's a command. Hey, have you ever, have you ever given advice to your kids the first time they go over to their significant other's family's house for dinner? Okay, something. I don't know that I went overboard. I think I just said act like you've eaten before. Okay, just don't. Or you've got a child and they're significant and they're intended. They're beloved. Their gal pal or boy pal are over for a meal, and they're shoveling the food in their face. So again, it's just wisdom literature. It's like kind of an idea, good thought, good thinking sort of stuff. So these are kind of the tools and there's a couple of others but they don't really come up in Ecclesiastes, so I won't go over them as well. So, but that's kind of wisdom literature, okay? So Ecclesiastes clearly falls into this idea of wisdom literature, okay? It isn't an epistle where it's telling the church, here's what you need to do, or here's how you need to take care of that problem, okay? It isn't Jesus telling the disciples, here's how you need to address the masses, or here's the truth of the kingdom kind of thing, okay? It's wisdom literature, okay? So there's some reflection on life, and there's some conclusion that we'll come to when we get to the end, okay, as far as that. If that's what the argument of the book is, what do we do with it? Okay, we'll get to that at the end. Well, first of all, let's talk about the book itself in general. The book has what's called a frame structure, all right? And again, not everybody agrees, but I do. So the book has a frame structure, okay? So there are two writers involved. There are two individuals involved. Now, I will tell you at the point, this could be a literary device, and it could be the same person. But the way it's written, there are two writers. Does that make sense? Okay? So, for example, like if you've ever read the book Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, Connecticut Yankee, the Mark Twain novel, okay? In that story, there's a guy walking along, and he meets a guy, and this guy's just walking along, and he meets a guy in a cave. He says, hey, what are you doing here? And the guy says, blah, 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 can I tell you a story? Sure, go ahead. And then the next 98% of the book is this guy telling a story. Now, what happened to the guy in the cave? Well, he's still there, apparently, but this guy is telling this whole story. And then the guy dies, and all of a sudden, you got the guy back at the end of the cave again. Okay? So you've got that sort of that's a frame structure. Okay? Have you ever had somebody come up to you, they're holding their phone, and I would do this, but it would make for a real, because my phone's back there. Somebody's holding their phone, and they say, listen, have you seen the video where Paul is teaching, and he throws in an error by intentionally? Have you ever seen that? Say, okay, now I'm going to show it to you, and I'm going to watch through and pay attention to when he does this, this, and this. Okay, ready, go. Then it ends, you watch the whole thing, no comment, you end. Okay, you see where he did it? And he did that and this. That's a frame structure, okay? So that's kind of how it is. So you've got somebody who's going to introduce the main body of the text. Then at the end of the book, the original person is going to come back and say, all right, what do we do with this? Okay? So today, all we're going to get through, that's my plan at least, is up through the introduction of the first writer. Okay, so it's a frame. So the book has a frame structure. There are two writers involved. Okay, I think there are two writers involved. That is my opinion. There are two writers involved. Okay, it's a small O opinion. If you want to say it's the same writer, to me, it doesn't. To me, it makes more sense to have two different writers, but that's fine if you agree differently. Okay, so the frame narrator is the first person. That's the person who's going to do chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, and that's the person who's going to come back in chapter 12. Okay, I'm calling him the frame narrator because that's just a slick and way to refer to him. Okay, the frame narrator. So what the frame narrator is going to do is he's going to introduce us to the main character. He's going to give us a summary of his thought, and then the main character is going to take over beginning with verse 12. Okay, so the frame narrator is not necessarily the main character, but the frame narrator is showing us this for a reason. Okay, And at the end of the book, the frame narrator comes back and says, okay, this is what we do with this. Okay? So the frame narrator is the first person, and at 1 through 11, he briefly shows up in chapter 7 and then comes back in 12. And depending on how you look at it, it's either all of chapter 12 or just chapter 12, 8 through 14. We'll get to that when we get to chapter 12. Okay? The other one, now this is where it gets interesting. Now really to understand Ecclesiastes, or to get a handle on what Ecclesiastes is, there's about three or four phrases or individuals that once you get an idea, and you have to decide, what does this mean? Who is this? What is that? And how you look at the book will depend on what you think these people are. Okay? So the first one is the teacher. So again, if we're in chapter 1, verse 1, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Okay? So we have the teacher, if you have an NIV. Okay? If you have a King James, it's the preacher. Okay, so someone's got a New King James. Somebody have a New King James? Is it teacher or preacher? So I think but it's preacher in the King James. Okay, or if you most modern ones just go with a Hebrew rendition of Kohelet, Qohelet, or it could be a K, Kohelet. Okay. Kohelet. Now, interestingly, that's when they translate, that comes from, and again, this is kind of getting into roots of words and things like that, but that word, when it's translated into Greek, comes from the root where we translate out the word assembly, which in the Greek is ecclesia, which is where we get the word church, but that ecclesia, coming back, that's where we get the name of the book. Out of that, this Hebrew word translated for the teacher, coming back, and again, there's a weird angle, but I'm just saying that's where Ecclesiastes comes from, the name of the book. Okay, the words of the teacher, the preacher, Kohelet. Okay, now the word Kohelet, now that's the one I'm going to use, Kohelet. I'm going to try to remember to refer to him as Kohelet, because then it just kind of eliminates the idea of, okay, is he a teacher, is he a preacher? And this, of course, Debbie and I are going through this class on a theology of work, which is interesting, but we've just been talking about different views of Ephesians 4, where you talk about apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, kind of thing. So it's like, okay, well, from a New Testament perspective, there's a difference between a teacher and a preacher. Okay? So it's like, which is it? Is it the teacher? Is it the preacher? It's Kohelet. See how I did that? I just went around the story. So, Kohelet, okay? It could also mean the teacher of the assembly. In fact, if you have an NIV, I think there's an NIV note at the bottom where it says leader of the assembly. Okay? Or is that the preacher? Is that the teacher? Is that the synagogue leader? No, at this point, it wouldn't have been the synagogue leader, but okay? The teacher of the assembly. Okay? The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. So you know that this book is about something said by Kohelet. Now the question then becomes, who is Kohelet? Who is Kohelet? Well, that depends on who you think wrote the book. Right? So I'll just put it this way, just summarize it this way. The book is either written by Solomon, King Solomon, or it's written by somebody who wants you to think it's written by King Solomon. Okay? Now, traditionally, most of us, I'm going to guess, grew up, were raised, taught that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, right? Is there anybody saying anything different? Okay. That Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes. Well, it's pretty obvious why Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes. Well, first of all, it says, words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Well, who's the son of David? Is Solomon a son of David? Yes. Well, there's a lot of sons of David. Jesus is a son of David. Okay? So there's a lot of people that could fill in son of David. But why Solomon? Well, it's talking about he's a teacher, he's wisdom, he's king. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I think we're all kind of familiar with the general story. He talks about having all of this power, having all of these wives, having all of these concubines, having all of these buildings. Certainly somebody who is in great power. And we think, well, who else could that have been but Solomon? Okay? And it makes sense to make Solomon, for Solomon to write this book. Okay? Because if you think about it, if you know, Solomon represents Israel at its peak. Okay? I mean, it never got bigger and stronger than it was when it was under Solomon. Okay? So, you know, when you look back at the kingdom under Solomon, and you can say, wow, if there was any moment where all of the promises that God said would happen to the people of Israel, it would be under Solomon. Okay? So when all of the glories of being God's chosen people were to come to fruition, it would have been under Solomon. Right? I mean, from a Jewish perspective. And yet, Solomon is writing about, wow, this isn't really that great. Okay? Which is kind of giving away sort of the reason why it's in the book, especially, you know, to me, looking at it from a New Testament perspective, is like, what is an indication? And remember when we talked about John the Baptist, and we said, you know, John the Baptist was a corrective to the Judaism at the time. That Judaism was going in this direction. But John the Baptist and his group, or his, you know, thinking from that perspective, could look back and say, you know, even when Judaism was at its best, that didn't result in what we thought it was going to result in. It resulted in Ecclesiastes. Okay, there's got to be a different way. Okay, so I mean, again, that's not how he put it, but I'm just saying. So this is why, you know, it's great that, you know, Solomon, because if it was anyone else, you would have said, well, yeah, but you weren't quite at the peak, right? You know, it's like, so it makes sense that Solomon wrote the book, okay? A tradition for years and years. And one of the reasons why it remained in the Jewish canon, because again, as far as it being in the Christian canon, is just, you know, most by the time, you know, the Way and first century church and all of that, because it came out of Judaism, nobody really questioned anything in the Old Testament. The Jewish leaders kind of decided what was going to be in the Jewish canon, and we just said, okay, we'll just take it. But one of the reasons why this remained in the Jewish canon was because of this traditional link to Solomon. Okay, well, this is the words of Solomon. He was one of the great kings. Okay, and the argument is that, now, a real brief summary of the life of Solomon. Okay, you know, we have David, King David, great guy, ruler for 40 years, has a lot of issues, but ultimately Solomon is born. Solomon builds the temple, asks for wisdom, again, you know, asks for wisdom, and is granted wisdom, but has all this power, has all of this authority, has all of these resources, finance, all of these people, but basically dies an apostate. Okay? You know, and you go through, and 1,000 wives, insert your own joke about not being able to afford more than one here, but you know, he has 1,000 wives, he's building altars and temples for all of them, and you know, but he basically dies an apostate. Okay? And there's nothing in the New Testament, there's nothing anywhere that ever says that Solomon repented. But the idea of Solomon writing this was that Solomon, in his apostate sense, this idol-worshiping sense that he had, or at least this syncretistic approach to things that he had, he kind of looked back and said, you know, on reflection, but this is just kind of an assumption. And that may be the absolute truth of what happened, okay? Unfortunately, the YouTube video has been deleted, so we don't really know, okay? But that's the argument as far as why Solomon wrote. I mean, because we know Solomon wrote, you know, Proverbs. There's several references to that. And so that's why we think that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes. Or it's somebody who wants you to think it's, why would it not be Solomon? What is the argument against Solomon? Well, the argument against Solomon is, first of all, why did he just say who he is? Why not just say Solomon? If Solomon's writing this, why doesn't Solomon just say, I'm Solomon? Okay? And again, remember, nobody agrees? Okay? Why not just say Solomon? Okay? Another thought is, Solomon, or the writer, Kohelet, is going through all of these things and talking about all of these injustices that are taking place. All of these bad things that are going on under the sun that he can see. Right? So it's like, if you were to hear, let's say your village has an issue with, I don't know, just like policing. Okay, police officers need to learn how to do something. And how do and you go and you hear a speech from the police chief. And the police chief says, the problem with the police department is we really need to teach the police officers how to do this, whatever it is. And again, it could be any department. If you're listening to the police chief say that, complaining about the police department, what would be a normal thought to have? You listen? Exactly. Well, do something about it. You're the police chief, right? Why are you telling me? You're the police chief. Do it. Like, or a parent complaining that, my kid never has Cheerios for breakfast. Well, go buy Cheerios. How difficult is that, right? Or get Cheerios from somewhere, all right? And so it's like, if you're the king and you have all of this power, again, Solomon was the most powerful king in Israel, over the united Israel that ever was. Why not fix these problems? Okay? Why not take care of these problems? Okay? And then the other thing is, like I said, there's no indication anywhere that Solomon ever came out of his apostate condition. He just dies. And again, we don't, in the New Testament, they don't talk about Solomon much. Right? I mean, there's a couple of references to the wisdom of Solomon, but mostly when they talk about the glory of Israel, they talk about David. Right? Although the kingdom was more powerful under Solomon. Had the temple, had the palace, had all of that. But they talk about David. They don't talk about Solomon. Okay? So the thought is the alternate idea is that somebody writing in Solomon's voice. Okay? And it's just a wisdom writer. It could be anyone. Could be one of the priests. It could be another king of Israel. Okay? Writing as Solomon. Maybe it's Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Rehoboam or Jeroboam? I can never remember which one is Solomon's son.
Yeah, Rehoboam.
Rehoboam. Maybe it's Rehoboam looking at Solomon's life and going, it's worse than he told me it was going to be. Of course, it's the kingdom splits under Rehoboam. But somebody says, okay, looking back, they're looking back on it and they're saying, wow, when we were at our most powerful, when Israel was at its most powerful, things weren't what we thought they were going to be. Okay? We thought it was going to be different. And how do we enunciate that? And somebody said, I know, let's kind of make a catalog of all of the things that were going wrong, and we'll do it in this literary form. Okay? So that's kind of the other way to look at it. And I lean that way. Okay? I lean that it's not Solomon. That Solomon is not the author of it. It could be that Solomon wrote this stuff and somebody collected it and put it together, because Kohelet, actually means the assembler. Okay? So it could be that these are just various writings that Solomon put together, okay, and then somebody assembled it later, right? Kind of like I don't think Moses sat down one day and said, it's Tuesday, I think I'm going to write Genesis. In the beginning, God created it. I don't think that's how Genesis or the Pentateuch was written. Okay, I think one day Moses sat down and somebody said, hey, Moses, tell us the story of Joseph. Okay, here's the account of Joseph. Boom, 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 boom. So tell us about Abraham. Okay, here's the account of Abraham. Abraham did this, 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 and this. And then somebody else came back later and said, hey, you know what? We can put these in order and call it Genesis. Okay, to me, that's how Genesis came to be. Now, Moses is the writer. Don't get me wrong, I'm not. But I don't think Moses sat down and said, in the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. Don't bother me. I've got to get to chapter 2. I don't think that's how it was done. Okay? And I think, and somebody else later, an editor came back in and said, okay, this is how we're going to put this together. Okay, so certainly by the time of Josiah, some have argued that that happened in Josiah's time, that they didn't actually discover the law in the wall, that just the priests finally put all of the writings together. These are all opinions, so there's speculation. Yes?
Stan, in your example, even though perhaps you had an editor for the context, we still consider Moses the author.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I said.
The same way then for Ecclesiastes, it still could be Solomon the
Yes.
author, but someone put it together.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it could be, that's what I'm saying. I mean, these could be things that Solomon said, or that people said Solomon said, or this could be written by somebody, one of Solomon's advisors, somebody that was close to Solomon, and he or she put it together in some way. Okay? But clearly the point, the author, if it isn't Solomon, the author wants you to think it is. Okay? So, I mean, I'm fine if you say it's Solomon, great, it's Solomon. I'm perfectly fine with that. It doesn't really change, to me, it doesn't really change the gist of the book. The other issues are, as you look in, and again, this is way above my pay grade, but as you look into, I'm told, that within the language used, the words used kind of thing, that there are words and phrases in there that are not recorded anywhere else. Like there's some various Aramaic words that are used in Ecclesiastes that are not recorded anywhere else at the time that Solomon was a king. Okay, so for example, and how we do that, if I refer to someone, there are just words that we use today, like if I said, oh, I got out my stapler and put the papers together, you would say, well, okay, whenever you did that, you didn't give me a date, but I know it had to happen after 1868, because that's when the stapler was invented. Okay? So if you say, well, George Washington got his stapler and put the papers together, you'd be like, whoa, wait a minute. I know from Sunday school that stapler wasn't invented until, 80 years later. Okay, so the same thing. So this is written, it had to be written after the stapler was invented, because before the stapler was invented, they didn't know what a stapler was. So nobody in 1820 was going to say, hey, he picked up his stapler. So if that's how somebody describes him, yeah, I'm living in 1820 and I got my stapler out, you're going to go, wait a minute, that person could not have actually lived in 1820, because somebody in 1820 wouldn't know what a stapler is. Okay, and so that's kind of the argument as far as the language goes, that there are words that are not recorded anywhere else at that time in some of the vocabulary used. Okay, that's a super technical point, and it's not the strongest argument, because the fact that it isn't recorded doesn't mean it didn't exist. Somebody had to be the first to record the word, right? It could have been the author of Ecclesiastes. It could have been Solomon. Okay, so any questions on that?
And there's some explicit references in the Pentateuch. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Wait a minute. There was no king. Yeah, obviously, well, that had to be written.
Which suggests when there was a king.
Or Moses was the meekest man in the world. I don't think Moses wrote that.
Yeah.
I don't think someone wrote this. So there are a few things like that even if we have very conservative, Moses wrote this. Obviously, there was some later editing.
Yeah.
So that's not a liberal point of view to say that there's some later editing going on.
And the only reason I point it out is because some people think that if you say, well, there was an editor that come in and it's like, oh no, you have die heretic. You've given into higher criticism. You've given into the Rudolph Bultmanns of the world. It's like, no, it is what it is. Yes, Dave.
The argument that Solomon wasn't the author based on the fact of why didn't he fix it, the things that are broken in Ecclesiastes, I haven't read it, and I also like to be missing it, but they're the fact that this world doesn't ultimately satisfy, and the sin that's causing these problems, and Solomon can't fix either of those, so the things that he could fix, he largely did. So I don't know if that's a good argument in my mind, that
Okay.
why didn't he fix it, that's just what I'm thinking.
Well, feel free to disagree with me. So again, so next week, those who agree with me will sit on this side. Those who agree with Dave will sit on that side. This side will get the candy bars. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. That's not true. No, that's a good point. But still, it's like as you're listening, all of these things that are wrong, you're like, it's like if you had a political candidate, and I don't know if maybe you guys haven't noticed this in Downers Grove, but I think you're having an election coming up. Okay, maybe it's because you can't see lawns anymore because of all the signs. But if you see somebody running for re-election and you go to hear a campaign speech, and all they talk about is how bad things have been for the past 4 years, and you're, at some point you want to go, okay, well, did you do anything about it? What did you do about these problems? These didn't suddenly just appear. What did you do about them? Kind of stuff. So again, to me, I'm Solomon. What did you do about these? But again, it's just these are the two main ideas. It's either Solomon, and that's the traditional, or like, to me, it doesn't really negate the argument when we get to the end of the book. It doesn't really weaken the argument when we get to the end of the book that if you say it's Solomon or it's not Solomon, but it's somebody writing in the wisdom literature tradition as Solomon, I don't think it's just these are the two. So if you pick up a book and you pick up a commentary and the commentary says, oh, Koheleth couldn't be Solomon, that's not a good point for a die heretic moment. Save those for the more interesting ones. So there's four realities. The book is either written by Solomon or somebody wants you to believe. And as Koheleth is looking at the world, as Koheleth is arguing, making his point, there are four realities, and I get these from Fee and Stewart in How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, which is the second best Bible study book I've ever read. Okay, the first one is How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler, which has nothing to do with Bible study. But if you read the Bible the way Adler tells you to read a book, we'd all be Bible scholars. Okay, but be that as it may, that's free. That will not be on your test. But he says there are four realities that he points out. Number one, God is the single indisputable reality. Because there's no question he's not an atheist. And part of his issue is that, if there's a God, why did these things happen? Okay, but God is indisputable reality. God's ways are not always understandable. Okay, again, you can go back to Isaiah, and I have the reference there, Isaiah 55, 8 and 9, my ways are not your ways, or that particular passage. God's ways are not always understandable. The way things are is very often always not what they should be. So I think the author of the book has a very clear idea on the way things should be. And he's just pointing out, wait a minute, this is how I thought things were going to be, and they're not. Okay? Perhaps it's like the person who goes into a marriage thinking it's going to be this way, and then, several short time later, you go, how's it going? And it's like, it's not at all what I thought. Maybe some of you have lived that. I don't know. I'm just saying. For me, it was much better. It's on video. It's recording. It's on video. It was much better. Much better. Debbie is shaking her head vociferously. Not for me. No. But be that as may. And finally, the other, and Debbie and I were talking about this on the way in. And this is somewhat that's problematic to me. Death is the great equalizer. Death is the great equalizer and is the end of all things. Okay, so it's like once you're dead, that's it. To Koheleth, once that happens, once you're dead, that's it. Okay, so in the Old Testament, and this is not a controversial opinion by any stretch of the imagination, but in the Old Testament, there isn't a very well-developed idea of the afterlife. As far like we talk about heaven and the angels and all of that and all that kind of stuff. There's references that there's clearly references. I mean, you can read in Daniel that there's something going on up there. Okay, but the fact that humans would die and go there is not something that's well developed in the Old Testament. Why that is intriguing to me, but I don't have an answer for it. Okay, it just isn't, and death is the end. Okay, and this is one of the reasons why those who are existentialists gravitate toward this book, because in one of the aspects of existentialism and one of the various permutations of it, you say, well, this life is all we have, this existence is all you have, existence. So take advantage of everything you've got, make the most of it, but keep in mind this is all you got. So again, to look at existentialism and say, well, we're all doomed, there's no reason to try anything. Yeah, that's one conclusion you can make. But another view of existentialism is to say, hey, you're responsible. You are the captain of your own fate. You are the master of your own ship. You need to jump in and do something about this, or you need to take control of your life, sort of stuff, because this is all you got, kind of thing. But death is a great equalizer. So as we go through and listen to some of the things that he says, you're going to find that that's the place. So, all right, well, it's 10 after 10. I didn't think I'd even, I thought I would be done after 15 minutes. Okay, so next week we'll get back into chapter 1, and we'll talk about the other fun words to talk about. Hebel, that's the Hebrew word, which is translated wind, air, or vanity, futility, all of that kind of good stuff. These basic concepts that'll roll us into Ecclesiastes. Any questions? Any final thoughts on it? So your assignment is to go home and read Ecclesiastes. Okay, don't overthink it. Just sit down and read it. Just kind of go, yeah.
It's a short book.
Yeah, 12 chapters.
It doesn't take long.
I just want to respond as quickly as I can to the idea of, I have no problem with Solomonic authorship, maybe a later Aramaic editor, but it looks like Solomon to me. Why, it's not persuasive to me, the argument, well, if you're Solomon, and why didn't you fix it?
Right.
To me, that would be part of the issue that he's presenting, that I am the smartest man in the world, I'm the most powerful man in the world, I'm the richest man in the world, I can't fix it. You know why? Because it can't be fixed. Everything is hopeless, it is vanity. No matter how much power and wisdom I have, I can't fix it because things are unfixable.
Yeah.
So that would be my response to that argument.
Which kind of talks,
This is all garbage.
yeah.
This is all vanity of vanities. That's all
Yeah,
hopeless.
which kind of leads into that even when things should have been the best,
Yeah.
that the point that Israel was at its most powerful, its most influential, its most blessed, there were still all of these issues. There were still these
Israel once said that
endemic
this is the
problems.
only time in the all history of Israel where it approximated world power.
Yeah,
And then-
that's what I was gonna say too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the only point at which Israel was a complete world.
Very short window of opportunity.
Yeah.
Because other empires had not yet arisen, Greeks, Romans, Babylonians,
Right.
Persians. And 1177 BC, have you ever heard of this, when civilizations collapsed? There was a power vacuum prior to this time, where so many great civilizations just kind of collapsed into disarray. And you had Israel just in this
Right-
very
right at that
narrow window
moment.
of time, a few decades, and that was it.
And things still weren't that great. So,
Yeah.
yeah, we'll get into that. But yeah, no, yeah. So you're going to be on David's side next week. Is that? No. Just kidding. So, all right, we'll see you guys.